to the scorecard, looking at these 4 characteristics, which using a DI style for annotation-based DI, it's really the reason to use annotation-based DI is that it's so easy to use. There's simply no third artifact. There's no XML to update every time you change the relationship between a class and another class, or every time you add a new component or class into your system or project. There's no XML to touch. Right? You just simply add the annotations, and everything literally auto-wires together. That's why we call it auto-wire. So that's the big feature, right? Maintainability, again, no extra XML artifact. That's nice. But you lose that central blueprint, right? That's a downside. There's no one place that you can look to see how everything's wired together. Today, in the Spring Source Tool Suite, it can generate graphs. It can generate bean graphs, just like it's always been able to do with XML. It can generate the same graphs or something very similar for applications that are auto-wired together. So that really helps mitigate that downside. And then implicit wiring, right? When we talk about implicit wiring, that means that if a transfer service needs an account repository and it's asking for it through its constructor in an annotation, it's asking for a Spring Bean by type, not by name. It's not asking for it by a bean ID. It's saying something more like, Spring, give me the object of type account repository. Usually this works just fine, but what if there are 2 account repositories in the container? Then we have an ambiguity. And there's all the facilities you need to solve those ambiguities or disambiguate those problems. But you have to do it, and that's where a qualifier comes in. So all the edge cases are handled. You can do anything you need to, but that's an extra step. And depending on how many of those cases you have, if that's the rule, not the exception, then using annotation-based DI might not feel so easy to use anymore, right? But most people just have maybe 1 or 2 of those kind of ambiguity cases, and they really get to reap the benefits, the rapid development benefits. Portability, again, Spring annotations render your code non-portable only with respect to porting your code across DI frameworks. So specifically, if you wanted to move from Spring to Juice, you would have to touch all of your plain old Java objects and change the annotations. That's what we mean by non-portable there. And again, that's why JSR 330 exists, is to solve that very problem. Juice respects those annotations. Spring respects those annotations. JSR 299, context and dependency injection, is built on top of JSR 330. So this is already a widely adopted standard. Now, let's talk about something that's brand new in Spring. This is what we call Java-based dependency injection, or simply @configuration classes. For those that have been around for a while, you may have known of the Java config project. And Java config was actually around for quite a while, almost 5 years. And there was a long-running experiment, and we found out what works and what doesn't work in that experiment, and so we moved a subset of it into core in Spring 3.0. So this is not a new idea. It's actually been road tested for quite a while. It does use annotations, but it uses them in a way that your dependency injection remains external to the code that you're configuring. Right? You get full programmatic control over instantiation, dependency injection, and anything else you want to do to an object. It allows for object-oriented configuration. Because your configuration artifacts are classes, objects, you can do class and object-like things with them. You can have inheritance. You can have composition, etc. It should be quite natural for a Java developer. And then, of course, it integrates well with other Spring DI styles like annotation-driven and XML-driven. This is a configuration class, very simple, vanilla one. If we have this notion of a transfer service that needs an account repository, notice that you're the one doing the instantiation. So it really feels like plain old Java, right? Transfer service needs an account repository. Why not just call a method? Right? So being methods instead of being elements in XML. But you can see the mapping is kind of one-to-one. This is what it looks like in XML, right? That same kind of externalized structure now represented in Java. Right? @configuration as an annotation kind of feels like the root level beans element, and of course @bean matches up to bean element. This is what it looks like to bootstrap an application that's based on configuration classes. in Spring 3, we added annotation config application context. And what we're passing into the constructor there as a class literal is that configuration class, appconfig.class. Once you've got that, it's just interacting with an application context like any other Spring application context. So you're reaching into it and calling getBean. Notice here that the getBean method that we're calling, we're asking for the object by type. We're not asking for it with a string-based identifier anymore. You can, but because Spring 3 uses generics, it can be fully type safe, and the less string-based identifiers, the better. And then, of course, we're just interacting with the object per its API, calling the transfer method, $100 from this account to that account. So let's see if we might cut into the questions for a moment, just so that we can see the feature that most folks probably haven't seen before. And this will give you a quick sense of the code base. I definitely encourage that you guys check this out from GitHub. I'll put that URL back up here, and hopefully you can fill in a few of the gaps that we missed because we didn't have the full time of the call. So that's configuration. And then you can see the scorecard on this, right? Ease of use, it's all Java, and we all know that. So it's easy to use, and we've got good IDEs that we're probably all masters with. It is external wiring, which is a good thing, right, because it's not invasive. It is also an additional artifact, but that additional artifact isn't so hard to maintain because it's all Java. We're used to that, right? It's general purpose Java, which might mean in some cases it's actually more verbose than XML, right? Just like in that property placeholder configure scenario, it actually ended up more verbose in Java, right? So just because it's Java doesn't mean that it's necessarily better. The XML namespaces basically serve as DSLs, domain-specific languages for configuration, and as such, they can be quite concise. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. XML might be exactly what you want in certain scenarios. For example, there are scenarios where you absolutely need to have it. Like if you want to turn on annotation-driven transaction management, the way to do that right now in Spring 3.0 is with the TX namespace, as it has been back since Spring 2.0. We realize that this is a limitation, right? You should be able to do that quite conveniently in code. So if you want to watch and vote, follow SPR 7420 that you see there, that's a feature slated for Spring 3.1 that will bring all of those kinds of switches for the container, right? TX annotation driven, task annotation driven, AOP, aspect J auto proxy, load time weaver, context MBean export, property placeholder configure. All of that stuff should be able to be done with code. So your feedback is appreciated on that issue. And then maintainability, we've got the compiler back as our friend, right? Developers can find what's being used and what methods are being called, plain old IDE. The blueprint is back, ultimately flexible. You can do whatever you want. And portable, right, because it's external configuration. So those are the strengths and weaknesses of configuration classes. Very quickly, previous Spring 3.1 features, right? We've got, as I just mentioned, SPR 7420, we call this Java-based application configuration. Because what we have in Spring 3.0 is Java-based dependency injection, right? Configuration classes and Bean methods are really about dependency injection, but we want to open up all the other container and application configuration switches like I was just talking about in code. Conditional Bean definitions. People have asked about this one forever, right? How do I define in Spring a Bean definition that has this value or this class or this implementation in dev and a different value in QA, a different value in production? It's a very real need. That's something that we're committing ourselves to in the Spring 3.1 timeline, so look out for that. And then also, for those that are familiar with Grails and Groovy World, the Bean Builder API, the Groovy Bean Builder, is slated for inclusion in Spring Core, currently in Spring 3.2. Maybe we'll get it into Spring 3.1, but currently in 3.2. So if you like to configure the container in Groovy, that'll be a possibility as well. You might call that a fourth style for those that like Groovy. So what's to take away here? The big thing to take away is that Spring is about choice. It always has been. Right? We really acknowledge what we believe to be the fact that there is not one prescriptive way to do most everything. Right? It's a complicated world in enterprise Java development. And so what we're trying to do with Spring and dependency injection is provide different kinds of tool sets that meet different kinds of needs and not make an assumption that there's only one way to do it. Of course, this places the burden on you that you understand what all those styles are, and that's why we're all here, right? Spring is about more than DI, right? When we compare Spring to other frameworks, other worthy frameworks like Juice or what have you, there is a portion of Spring that can be compared, but that's only the DI portion, right? Things like Juice, for example, don't do much beyond DI. They don't have that kind of ambition as a feature, right? They're small, concise frameworks. So think about what Spring's really about. And then when you think about Spring XML, remember that most of the Spring XML namespaces are actually not about dependency injection. They're about enabling sometimes quite sophisticated features in a very few number of lines of XML. And again, you'll be able to do that in code in the future. But we think that the Spring XML namespaces are actually quite nice. Hopefully you do too. Rules of thumb. One thing that you can kind of carry around in your head is that if you own it, if you wrote the class, consider annotating it with annotations like @component and auto-wired, or the JSR 330 annotation. Why? Because it reaps all those development benefits, speed of development, and so on. Take advantage of what we call the stereotype annotations. That's component, but the annotations that work like components but have different names, like service and repository. If you use annotation-based Spring MVC, you know @controller, right? That helps describe the different parts of your application, and then you can apply policies through AOP to things that are repositories versus things that are services, and they're all candidates for component scanning. And know that it's probably the case that some XML will be required, maybe even desired in certain parts of the application. Right now, a great example is things like transaction management. Again, the only way to do that is in XML, but you end up with a XML config file that's 1 or 2 lines long, right? Maybe you're turning on component scanning and you're turning on transaction management, right? Probably have some little bit of XML in your application. And if you're not yet using some kind of Spring tooling, the biggest takeaway is start doing that today, right? STS, of course, is what we produce, Spring Source Tool Suite, and we love that. But whatever you're using as an IDE probably has good Spring tooling. So if you're not using it, definitely do that. And let's see. So we're currently right at the hour. I'm happy to stick around. So for those that need to leave right now, that's the end of the formal content. Let me show you the links page, right? So you can go grab the code. You can communicate with me there on GitHub about that code or via Twitter. That's the link to the book, right? Get a plug-in there. And I'll leave that up. If you've got to go, you've got to go. But otherwise, I'd love to take some questions.